The day the judge said the children would not be coming home with me, I did not cry. I sat in that bright room and listened while strangers explained my life in clipped official sentences. On paper, I was a temporary caregiver. On paper, my sister was a mother reclaiming her place. On paper, 10 years of packed lunches, late-night fevers, school meetings, and good nights were an arrangement that had gone on longer than expected. My name is Hannah Mitchell, and by the time I walked out of that courthouse, I had already spent a decade raising the 2 children my sister left in our parents' old house like luggage she meant to pick up later. She said she needed a break, a reset, a few months to get her life together. She never came back. I stayed. That was the difference between us. Inside that house, those kids learned the shape of my footsteps, the sound of my keys in the door, the way I always checked on them twice before I went to bed. Outside that house, my sister learned how to tell a story that made her look like the one who had been wronged. When she finally returned, she brought lawyers instead of apologies. In the end, the court believed the version that fit better in a file. They took them from me. What happened afterward did not just change my life, it rewrote hers. The truth has a way of doing that when you force it into the light. Before I tell you what she said in that courtroom, and what came apart after I left it, tell me, what time is it where you are? And where are you listening from? I want to see how far this story reaches. By the time my sister brought the children to the house, most of her choices had already been made without them in mind. She arrived late in the afternoon with her car packed far beyond what made sense for a short stay. Clothes crammed into bags, a couple of boxes half-taped, a basket full of shoes. It looked less like a visit and more like a transfer. She moved quickly, talking about a new city, a man who finally understood her, a job that would match her talent. The children were additions in that story, mentioned only when I steered the conversation back to them. She called the plan simple. She would leave them with me for a little while, in the house our parents had left behind. The school district was decent, the neighborhood steady, my schedule flexible enough to handle it for now. She spoke as if she were offering me something rather than handing over everything she no longer wanted to hold. What she did not offer was a date. There was no timeline, no outline of how she would stay involved from another state, no discussion of cost. Her bags told the truth her words avoided. She was not pausing anything. She was stepping away. The children stayed near the doorway at first, each clutching one object with a grip that said it had survived other moves. They watched the flow of bags and boxes with the kind of focus that comes from experience, not curiosity. When I carried their things upstairs, they followed without a word. They did not ask how long they would be there, or where their mother would sleep. They inspected each room as if deciding what they were allowed to rely on. My sister remained just long enough to make the arrangement look reasonable. She slept in the guest room, left her things scattered across the bathroom counter, drifted through the kitchen while I tried to fit 2 new lives into a rhythm that had already been set. She described apartment tours and interviews, weekends with the man waiting for her, the relief of finally living without anchors. When the children edged closer to her on the couch, she shifted her attention back to her phone. She left on a Thursday. Her goodbye sounded casual. She promised transfers when she could, calls once things settled, visits when her schedule allowed. None of it was specific. All of it depended on a future centered entirely around her. For a while, deposits arrived sporadically. They never matched what the children needed, but they gave her something to point to if anyone questioned her role. Along with the transfers came messages that sounded less like concern and more like reminders. She insisted it made sense for her to keep claiming them on tax forms, since she was the one helping financially, even as my paychecks covered groceries, school fees, and everything that did not fit into her version. The children adapted by watching what remained consistent. They learned where their backpacks belonged, how evenings unfolded, which cabinet held their cereal. When a nightmare woke them, my doorway was the one they appeared in. As months turned into a year, my sister's presence thinned. Messages shifted from asking about their days to asking for copies of documents and signatures on forms. She needed their names on records she still wanted access to. I needed to make sure they had lunch money and shoes without holes. There was no moment when her involvement stopped. It wore away in increments. One postponed visit, one unanswered call, one more holiday marked only by a late text. By the time I noticed how little space she actually occupied in their daily lives, the children no longer spoke about living anywhere else. They did not talk about going back. They talked about school, friends, and the house that, slowly and without anyone saying it out loud, had become home. Years have a way of stretching a temporary favor until it starts to look permanent. One school year slipped into the next. Report cards piled up in a drawer, sneakers were replaced, and the children grew into spaces they once had to jump to reach. What began as "for a little while" settled into the only arrangement that actually worked. Our days fell into a pattern. Mornings were alarms, cereal, missing notebooks, and the rush to get out the door. Afternoons meant my laptop open beside their homework. Evenings were simple dinners, small arguments over chores, and the sequence of lights dimming and doors checked before bed. It was repetitive, imperfect, and entirely ours. From outside, it probably looked ordinary. 2 kids in an old family house, a woman working enough to keep the bills paid. No announcements, no big turning points. Just the ongoing work of making sure there was food on the table and someone to sign whatever needed signing. My sister hovered at the edges. She sent brief messages about new jobs and new apartments, about opportunities that kept her moving. When she referenced the children, it was usually in one polished sentence that made her sound involved. She seemed more attached to the idea of being their mother than to the daily reality of it. Every so often, the internet filled in more than her words. Photos of rooftop gatherings, office celebrations, weekends away. She looked rested and proud of the life she was building. I never saw a backpack in the background, never heard about parent-teacher conferences or late-night trips to urgent care. Whatever she was building, it was not centered around bedtime routines. I did not keep score. I was too busy making sure everyone had what they needed. What stayed with me was not outrage, but a steady awareness that we were not sharing the same load, no matter how often she used "we" when she talked about the kids. The children adjusted in the only way they could. They learned the rhythm of the household, when to joke, when to ask questions, when to give me space. Their memories anchored themselves to the life we were actually living. The route we took to school, the way we celebrated small wins, the nights we ate leftovers on the couch because I was too tired to pretend otherwise. Their references to my sister changed over time. At first, they sounded expectant, guesses about visits, calls, holidays. Eventually, those guesses thinned out. She shifted from a person they waited for to a relative they mentioned, someone who existed more in stories than in day-to-day life. She was not erased, but she was no longer the point everything else revolved around. On forms, my name went down by default. On contact lists, I was listed first and as backup. Teachers and neighbors stopped asking how long the kids were with me and started saying "your kids" without correcting themselves. The language around us shifted even when I still hesitated to use certain words out loud. In my own mind, I stayed careful. I signed as primary contact, responsible adult, caregiver. I avoided labels that felt like claims on territory my sister had walked away from, but never officially released. It seemed safer to carry the work than to name it. Reality, however, had already decided. It showed in who the children reached for when something went wrong, whose opinion they checked before making choices, whose schedule they factored into their own. It showed in the way they moved through the house without asking for permission to exist there. By the time 10 years had passed, No one needed to ask whether I was committed. That answer lived in 1,000 ordinary days behind us. The question I never thought to prepare for was what would happen if the person who had stepped away suddenly tried to step back in and insist that none of those days mattered. It did not start with a phone call or a warning. My sister simply appeared one afternoon, as if 10 years could be folded up and put away in the time it took to walk from the street to the front door. By then, the house had settled into a version of life that did not include her. Shoes in the entryway, papers on the counter, a calendar marked with practices. She stepped into that space like someone returning from a short trip, not someone who had chosen another life in another place. She moved through the rooms with a restless inspection, touching furniture, scanning photos, measuring what had changed and what had stayed the same. Nothing in her expression suggested regret. What I saw instead was assessment, an inventory of what she still believed was hers. The children noticed before she reached them. They paused and went still in a way I had not seen in years. They did not run to her. They watched the way people do when something from the past re-enters the present without explanation. They drifted closer to me just enough to redraw the lines of where they stood. My sister talked about traffic and the years that had slipped by. She spoke about promotions, a bigger apartment, people who appreciated her talent. When she mentioned the children, it was as part of her story, a supporting detail in a speech about how hard it had been to be away and how ready she was to be there now. The words were polished. She did not ask what their days looked like. She did not ask who their friends were, what they worried about, what they were proud of. Her questions, when they finally came, were about paperwork, living arrangements, who was listed where. She was not trying to understand the life we had built. She was trying to locate leverage inside it. The shift came when she understood how deeply anchored the children were here. Their rooms, their routines, the way they moved through the house without hesitation. All of it contradicted the version she needed, the one where I was a placeholder and she was the rightful center returning to claim her role. She began to treat my consistency as intrusion, my choices as overstepping. Conversations sharpened. She pointed to doctor visits, school decisions, my name on emergency forms as proof that I had crossed a boundary. In her telling, I had treated a family favor like a chance to take over. What I had done out of necessity, she recast as ambition. What struck me most was how prepared she sounded. This was not a woman feeling her way through an uncomfortable reunion. This was someone presenting a case. She needed this story to be true for someone, and if she said it with enough confidence, it could sound reasonable to people who had not lived the years in between. The first sign that this would not stay contained came when she mentioned getting things on record. She did not raise her voice or threaten. She spoke about her rights, about what any mother would do, about systems built to correct situations like this. In that framing, the decade she had spent elsewhere became background noise. The problem, in her eyes, was me. I understood then that we were no longer arguing over memory. We were positioning ourselves for an audience that would only see documents. I knew what those documents would show first. Birth certificates, matching last names, the absence of formal custody orders with my signature. Inside the house, time was on my side. Outside of it, the paperwork was not. The envelope arrived a few weeks later with a heading I had hoped never to see. The language inside was careful and detached, but the meaning was simple enough. My sister had not returned to reconnect. She had returned to contest legal control over the life she had chosen to leave behind. The case stopped belonging to us the moment it landed on a judge's docket. Hearing dates were set, reports were ordered, and suddenly 10 years inside that house had to be reduced to forms and statements. What had been daily life for us became material for other people to review. In meetings, my name appeared under headings like informal caregiver and non-parent custodian. The children were described as minors in need of a stable arrangement. My sister on paper was the biological mother seeking reunification. None of those phrases were technically wrong. They were simply stripped of the context that gave them weight. Her filings were precise. She emphasized regret without naming choices. She highlighted every transfer she had ever sent, every saved message that could be framed as involvement. She did not need to tell the whole story. She only had to present a version that fit the categories the court already recognized. I learned how narrow those categories were. Biology carried heavy weight. Stated intention counted, even when it arrived years late. Formal absence drew more attention than quiet distance. The fact that I had been there every day mattered, but mostly inside a system that prefers signatures over memories. The first hearing was brief. Attorneys recited histories as if they were reading out of a file. I listened to my life summarized in the third person while my sister sat a few chairs away, eyes fixed on the bench. When it was my turn, I answered exactly what was asked. Anything that sounded like anger could be repackaged as a concern about my stability. In the end, the court did what courts often do when faced with competing claims and incomplete paperwork. It chose a holding pattern that kept control in its own hands. A temporary order was signed. The children would be moved to a neutral placement pending further review. My role was acknowledged but not secured. My sister's rights were preserved but not fully restored. When the order was read, I did not stand or object. Reactions are observed even when they are not addressed. I kept my hands still and my voice level, and the only effort I allowed myself was to keep breathing evenly. The children looked at me instead of the judge. They took their cues from my face, not from the language in the order. The transition that followed was handled with practiced efficiency. Appointments appeared on schedules. Placement details arrived in carefully worded letters. I was given a list of times and locations where I would be allowed to see the children under supervision, as if I were the one who had only recently entered their lives. My sister's access was outlined separately, tied to requirements she had not yet met. Walking out of the courthouse, I understood something that cut deeper than the order itself. To the system that had just rearranged us, we were one more file in a long stack. The outcome might reshape our future, but for the people processing it, this was a normal day at work. At home, nothing and everything felt different. The shoes by the door stayed lined up. The marks on the kitchen wall still showed how tall the children had grown. Their rooms were exactly as they had left them. It was the missing noise that made the space feel wrong, like a scene held on pause. I did not soothe myself with the idea that things would fix themselves. Systems do not correct out of guilt. They respond to what can be documented and checked again. As much as I hated admitting it, the next step would not be decided by who cared more. It would be decided by whose version could be shown in a way the law could not comfortably ignore. Do you believe the justice system usually gets it right? Or does it sometimes just settle on the option that looks safest on paper? Weeks went by, and the file with our names on it stopped being simple. More agencies stepped in. Requests for records went out in different directions. What began as a narrow question about where the children should live turned into an examination of how we had all actually been living. I stayed where I had always been, answering what I was asked, and watching the shape of the story shift away from what my sister had rehearsed. The first fractures in her version appeared in places she clearly had not expected anyone to examine. Work histories did not support the steady career she described. Address records showed frequent moves instead of the stability she liked to mention. Dates she had offered so confidently in court collided with entries on paper that could not be adjusted to fit. Financial information raised sharper questions. She had listed the children as dependents on forms long after they were living with me. Applications showed their names used to qualify for better housing and health care, tied to services in cities they had never seen. On paper, She had been parenting them in locations that did not match their school records or medical charts. Once those mismatches appeared, they were not brushed aside. Old files came out of storage. Former landlords and neighbors were contacted. Early school records from before the children moved into my care were added to the stack. Notes from that time did not match the picture of a parent doing everything possible under impossible pressure. Patterns emerged: repeated absences, late pickups, missed appointments. Reports of adults cycling through the apartment while the children were left to steady themselves. No single line was explosive, but together they described a life built around her impulses, not their needs. My part in this stayed direct. I turned over email threads, screenshots of the few transfers she had made, bank statements showing money going out for field trips, groceries, shoes, and everything else that kept the house running. I did not try to frame the numbers. They lined up with the days I remembered. That was enough. The children met with specialists whose work was to listen and record. They were asked about routines, fears, and who they expected to show up when something went wrong. They answered in the plain way kids use when they do not realize their words are being weighed. Their names and mine kept appearing together in those notes under phrases about trust and stability. I learned about the results in condensed reports. Terms like primary attachment and long-term caregiver were written next to my name. My sister's involvement was labeled sporadic and dependent on personal priorities. The contrast between those descriptions did more than any speech I could have prepared. As more information landed in the file, my sister's certainty began to look like defiance. She still presented herself as someone reclaiming what had been taken, but each document undercut that claim. The story she had leaned on, temporary hardship, necessary distance, a mother fighting her way back, could not stand beside the record of where she had actually been. What struck me was how detached the process remained even as the balance shifted. No one apologized. No one praised me. The system did not move because it cared about who had suffered more. It moved because the evidence no longer supported the conclusion it had been drifting toward. Accepting that changed the way I looked at all of it. I stopped expecting recognition and aimed only for accuracy. If I was going to be measured, I wanted it to be against what had truly happened, not against who delivered the more persuasive story. Facts do not care who sounds more sympathetic. They care who can show their choices in a way that holds up when excuses are removed. If someone pulled the records on your life and laid them out side by side, what would they say about you? The day of the final hearing felt ordinary. Another line on the calendar, another building with metal detectors and fluorescent lights. The difference was invisible from the outside. This time the story was no longer built on what my sister said, but on what could be proven. The judge spoke in measured phrases, linking months of reports and interviews. There was no drama in the delivery, only a conclusion. The children would not be placed with my sister. They would return to my home as their permanent residents, with legal authority granted to me. Conditions followed. Any contact between my sister and the children would be limited, supervised, and dependent on her meeting standards she had never met consistently. The court left the door open only on paper. What surfaced during the review did not disappear once custody was settled. Agencies that handle benefits and tax compliance open their own files. The way my sister had continued to claim the children on forms, the way she had used their names to qualify for advantages in cities they never lived in, now had consequences beyond hurt feelings. Repayments were calculated, penalties added up. Her record, once unmarked, began to carry entries that would follow every application she submitted. Work shifted in the same direction. A promotion she had been celebrating fell through after a routine check. A later job offer was withdrawn after further review. No one pointed to a single incident, but the pattern was there. In systems that quietly sort people by risk, She had placed herself in the group that sees doors close without explanation. Family reactions changed too. Relatives who had once repeated her version of events stopped speaking about it with certainty. Some apologized to me in brief messages. Others simply stepped back from her. It was just what happens when people no longer want to defend a story that has been taken apart piece by piece. I did not try to manage any of that. I did not ask anyone to choose sides. I made one decision only. I removed myself and the children from her reach. Blocking calls and messages was not an outburst. It was a line drawn for our safety. Having the children back under my roof did not reset life to what it had been before the case. They carried the disruption with them in extra questions and new hesitations, a sharper sense that their lives could be rearranged by people they had never met. I carried it in the way I double-checked plans and kept key documents in a folder that never left the house. We moved forward anyway. School, meals, chores, appointments, quiet moments that did not need to be explained to anyone outside our walls. The house settled into a shape that matched who actually lived there. The absence of my sister was no longer a gap. It was a boundary. Her life continued somewhere else under the weight of the outcomes she had set in motion herself. Legal obligations did not vanish. Financial strain did not fade quickly. Opportunities no longer arrived as easily. Whatever version of herself she tried to present now had to coexist with the record attached to her name. That was the cost of using other people as leverage instead of caring for them. For me, the clearest lesson is this: being related to someone does not grant them endless chances to walk in and out of your life. Leaving responsibilities behind and expecting to reclaim authority later is not love. It is entitlement. At some point, the years you were gone speak louder than the words you use when you want back in. If you have stayed with me to the end of this story, thank you. If you were in my place, would you ever allow my sister to be part of your world again? And if any part of her choices feels uncomfortably familiar, what would you change now, before the consequences start deciding for you?